What's your particular area of expertise?
My research focuses on how children come to understand the social world, and in particular how they come to understand what kind of people are in the world and what those people are like.
Along those lines, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about bias from previous bodies of research. Do we know at about what age kids begin to form their biases?
Children begin to form some forms of bias very, very early. For example, even fairly young babies show looking time preferences towards the gender and the race of their primary caregiver. Those aren't necessarily rich social preferences, but it does seem like they're tuning into faces that have a familiar structure and that look like the people they're seeing around them most commonly. A little bit we might think of as richer or more problematic social biases, like biases in favor of some groups over others, seem to generally appear a little bit later, maybe around age 3, 4, 5 would be kind of the ages at which those are really sort of setting in more powerfully.
What draws children to particular groups? Can you tell me a little bit about the research?
One of the major goals of my research program is to better understand why it so often seems to happen that children end up kind of replicating or recreating the same forms of bias that are present in the adults around them. So, for example, similar forms of racial prejudice, similar forms of gender stereotyping. Why does this seem to happen so reliably? I think the most common intuition is that this is probably some form of parental transmission, that parents are teaching their children how to be biased. But in many cases, it looks like while that might be a piece of the picture, it's definitely not the whole picture. And one way to get at that is to think children are not just sort of passive internalizers. They are not merely sponges. Children are also making decisions about what to learn, who to interact with, what to read, what to talk about, what to ask. And we're really interested in how those active decisions that children make, how children's own agency might in some cases feed in to the creation of new forms of bias or more powerful forms of bias.
Tell me a little bit about the research study. What did you and your colleagues do? How many kids were involved?
There's quite a variety of different things we work on, but some of the work I wanted to tell you about today is really inspired by this observation from the adult world that many of us live in what you might think of as sort of an information bubble, that we like to seek out information that kind of bolsters or clarifies or supports what we already think. So you can think about this as the kind of confirmation bias. You can think about the sort of media bubble or social media bubble that we all live in, that we like to consume information, we like to talk to people that have very similar views to us. And that often reinforces those beliefs and doesn't give us access to an unbiased set of information about the world. And we are really curious about whether children would show the same tendency. Would children tend to seek out information that supports and reinforces what they already know or already think, especially about the groups to which they belong?
Tell me how you went about studying this.
What we did first is we wanted to study children's kind of abstract understanding of groups. So rather than focus on a real world kind of culturally salient group like race and gender, which we do often study and which is very important to study, but in this particular work, we wanted to kind of strip away kids' prior knowledge. So we put kids into groups that they had never heard of before based on something really similar, really simple, like a color. So we might say, you're going to be in the yellow group or you're going to be in the green group. We might randomly assign them to a group based on color. And past work from both my lab and other research groups has shown that just doing this is enough to get kids to like their own group more. So merely by randomly assigning a kid to, say, the yellow group, if you then ask kids which group do you like better, or what do you think about these kids that are in the red group or the yellow group, kids will prefer members of their own group. It's not that they dislike the other group, but they seem to just be a little more positively predisposed towards their own group. So that was sort of the starting point for our study. We placed kids into these groups and we assessed their attitudes, and we could ascertain that they did, in fact, have a bias in favor of their own group, though not a particularly powerful one. And again, that was sort of the setup for our study. Since we are then interested in children's own choices, we then presented them with the opportunity to choose between different stories that they could read or have read to them that would give them more information about the groups to which they belonged. So we might, for example, say, you can hear this story, which is written by someone who really likes your group but doesn't really like the other group. Or you can hear this other story written by someone who really likes the other group but doesn't really like your group. And we then just tried to see what story did children choose. And what we found is that they overwhelmingly, at something around 80% of the time, chose the story that favored their own group. So what this means is they're seeking out information actively that seems to support their pre-existing beliefs that their own group is better. We also asked which of these stories should we read just to another kid who's going to come in later, and we found that just as powerfully, they wanted us to read the story that painted their group in a positive light. So they're not only choosing information that favors their group, they're also seeming to want to control the flow of information in ways that will paint their group in a positive light. One other thing to say about this is we then actually did read them a story that had the kind of content we said it did. So for that matter, for 80% of the children, we read them a story that said good things about their group and less good things about the other group. And we then assessed their attitudes again. And when we did that, we found that the information that they chose in this biased fashion then led them to develop more polarized attitudes and actually to develop negativity towards the other group. So we were able to sort of produce through the child's own choices the sense that the groups are now much more distinct and much more polarized, and that their own group is a lot more positive.
What does this say to parents then, Yarrow, about the way children form their biases? As parents, how do we address it?
The thing that I would say to most emphasize for parents is that their children are active agents. They're making active choices about what to consume, and in many ways that's great. We want our children to be active learners, active explorers of their environment. But it also means their own pre-existing biases might influence their choices, and they might make further choices such as who to interact with, what kinds of information to consume, that will sort of cement or further kind of support or even amplify those initial biases. If we think about what we can do as parents, this is something I think about a lot as the father of a 4-year-old. One of the things is, given those biases that children will make in their own choices, we can present our children with learning opportunities that maybe run the opposite direction, right? So in one way, this is the very simple and very intuitive idea for why it's important to present our children with diverse experiences, with exposure to diverse kinds of stories and diverse individuals, because those are presenting them with opportunities to hear different stories, to hear stories that will emphasize the positive aspects of other groups, of other social identities, and in that sense can hopefully steer them away from always choosing things which amplify and reinforce their existing biases.
Could you give me some examples of ways that parents can expose their kids to some of these other activities?
Some of the ways that parents can expose their children to alternative stories, to alternative perspectives, includes both the diversity in their environment, and sort of this relates to issues around school choice, neighborhood choice, but also through the kinds of media and books that children consume. So there's now, if you just look at kind of representation, say, of other perspectives of racial and ethnic minorities in children's books, it's unfortunately kind of lacking, but that's not to say those books don't exist. There are many wonderful stories, many wonderful TV shows, movies that highlight and feature diverse perspectives, and that form of exposure is likely to be one very positive thing that parents can do.
Why is it particularly important for parents right now to think about exposing their kids to these diverse ideas?
We are clearly in a really specific moment in our country's history where issues around discrimination and prejudice, especially focused on race and racial injustice, are really front and center. And one of the real, I think, tragedies of parenting in the United States, especially among white parents, is there's often a great reluctance to even talk about or engage in discussion about issues of race. And the problem with that is it often will communicate to children that these are difficult or taboo or shameful topics. It can transmit our own ease, our own discomfort, our own unease to our children. And by engaging in those discussions or creating opportunities through stories, through social interactions, through media, to foster those discussions and to foster that exposure, we are I think actually protecting our children from some of the simplest forms of the sort of emergence of discrimination, prejudice, racism, and so on.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you would want people to know about your research or about the topic?
The one thing that I would really like to highlight, though, is that our children are actively trying to make sense of a really, really complicated social world, and they're taking a lot of cues from us and from the information we provide them. So it's really worth us being thoughtful about how we're engaging with issues of social justice, issues of race, issues of gender, because our children are picking up on even sometimes subtle cues from their parents. So it's important for us to be deliberate and to be intentional about how we talk about and engage with these issues.